Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for a presentation around the EPA National Recycling Strategy. We'll be looking at some of the grant programs that the EPA has put out there to help drive education outreach and markets development for the recycling community. My name is Peter Houstel. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Recycling Network. And shortly, Maya Sjogren and Lawrence Doppelt will join us from EPA to tell their story. They have a great story to tell, I believe, and they're talking about money, so we should all be paying attention. Before we go there, though, I just want to remind everybody that we have some more events coming up from the Maryland Recycling Network. On Thursday, February 23rd, Angie Webb from MES will give us an update on the Maryland markets and what we can expect going forward. And then on Thursday, March 30th, we have 5 or 6 different organizations, such as Loading Dock, Goodwill, et cetera, who are going to talk about how they drive reuse through their systems. And then on Thursday, April 27th, Crystal Dreisbach will talk about the Don't Waste a Durham reuse program, which we featured at the conference last year. And she'll also be joined by somebody from upstream to talk about the whole concept of reuse as it's being driven around the country. And then, of course, on Monday, June 12th, we will be having our conference at the Turf Valley Conference Center in Ellicott City. I hope all of you plan to join us there. It should be a great event. We'll begin to post some program tidbits in the next couple of weeks. We're still in the planning stages, but we welcome everybody to keep an eye on the website and be sure to register as soon as you possibly can. If you would like to have any questions answered by our presenters, I ask you please to use the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll share those questions with the presenters as they go forward. And then, of course, this webinar will be recorded so that you can view it after the fact or share it with anyone whom you feel might be interested. So with that said, I want to make sure that we thank all the people that helped the Maryland Recycling Network keep its act together: Infinity Recycling, Maryland DC DE, Delaware Beverage Association, Tech Safe Recyclers, Waste Management, Mariner Management, MSW Consultants, and the Northeast Maryland Waste Development Authority. Very important that we have that support. And if anyone would like to join this list, please don't hesitate to let me know. We're always looking for more folks to help us keep things going. And of course, we always like to have a reason to smile, and I think life is too short to be taken seriously, as a very smart author once said. But if you ever wondered where those cars that you donate to NPR and PBS go, well, here it is, right here in front of us. So with that, I want to turn the microphone over to Maya Sjogren and Lawrence Doppelt. Maya, the show is yours. Have at it.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having us. I'm Maya Sjogren, and I'm from EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery. My colleague Lawrence Doppelt and I will highlight our grants programs that were recently announced. These are grants for recycling, composting, and reuse. So first, we'll provide a little overview on the federal attention on materials management, highlight the National Recycling Strategy, and then we'll talk about the new programs that were funded and authorized under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Those include the Model Recycling Program Toolkit, our new grant programs, both for education and outreach, as well as infrastructure. And then we'll also highlight the Battery Collection Best Practices and Labeling Guidelines program. So we're really encouraged that there's a lot of federal attention on materials management right now, and this is driving a lot of EPA's work. In the 2020 appropriations, Congress directed EPA to produce a national recycling strategy. And then several months later, in December 2020, the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act passed, and that provided authority for EPA to issue grants related to solid waste infrastructure. It didn't include funding, but it gave us authority to issue grants. The Save Our Seas 2.0 Act also directed us to develop several reports around plastics, as well as a plastics strategy. The Government Accountability Office issued a report in December 2020 that included recommendations, including for EPA to identify future policies needed to strengthen the recycling system. The FY21 appropriations asked EPA to collect data on recycling and single-use plastics. And the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed in November 2021, provided us with the funding necessary to actually issue the grants and also to create a few new programs. We are also pleased the National Recycling Strategy came out on the same day that the bipartisan infrastructure law was signed. So that was on America Recycles Day in November 21. And the National Recycling Strategy identifies the actions needed to create a more resilient and cost-effective recycling system. There are 24 pieces of proposed national legislation on the Hill related to food waste and recycling. So we will see where those go. There are some challenges to the US recycling system that I'm sure you're all aware of. One is that we have inadequate recycling infrastructure in the US and limited market demand for some recyclables. There's also a lot of confusion on what is recyclable, and that causes contamination in the recycling feedstock. There are environmental justice concerns, including the siting of facilities, as well as access to recycling. And those challenges help to frame our objectives in the National Recycling Strategy. So there are 5 objectives. The first is to improve markets for recycled commodities, because if there is not a market value for a commodity, then its likelihood of being recycled is very low. Increasing collection and improving the materials management infrastructure, reducing contamination in the recycled material stream so that those materials have a higher value, enhancing policies and programs to support circularity, and to standardize measurements and increase data collection so that we can track our progress in meeting the national recycling goal to hit 50% recycling rate by the year 2030 and better understand how our interventions are doing. The strategy focuses on enhancing national municipal solid waste or household recycling system. And the actions, there are nearly 50 actions in the strategy. They are to be stakeholder-led actions, not just EPA or not just federal actions, but all the actions needed from across the value chain to create a stronger, more resilient, more equitable, and cost-effective recycling system. The strategy acknowledges that recycling is only one part of what is needed to achieve a circular economy. And the strategy also commits EPA to developing additional strategies, including a strategy on plastics, food waste and organics, electronics, textiles, and the built environment. The plastics and the food waste strategies are in draft form, and we're hoping to release those for public comment later this year. So I'll now highlight a few examples of actions in the strategy. Under the increased collection and improve materials management infrastructure objective, one of the actions is to implement incentives, policies, and programs that result in increased collection. Another action is to increase the consideration of recoverability and sustainability when designing products. You're likely well aware that some products by design are not recyclable. So for instance, some materials contain multiple resins and therefore they are difficult to recycle with today's infrastructure. We want to encourage manufacturers to design products and packages that can be recycled. Under the objective C, reduce contamination in the recycled materials stream. One action is to develop a plan to assist state and local governments with contamination. We are encouraged that some states are leading the way. For instance, Oregon now requires all counties in Oregon to accept the same materials in their recycling stream, and thus all residents of Washington are aware of what's recyclable, and that can help decrease contamination and confusion. We want to see an consistency of labels for recyclable products in recycling bins, and that will help address the consumer confusion about what can be recycled and which bins to use. We are aware that some labels are misleading, and we want to promote labels that are not misleading, as there is currently a lot of confusion about the resin codes on the bottoms of plastics.
A lot of states are looking at the issue of labeling, and particularly the chasing arrows, as being problematic. Are you anticipating any kind of federal level action around the chasing arrows?
It's a great question. We're really encouraged that the Federal Trade Commission, who issues the green guides, the green guides is basically a mechanism to help reduce greenwashing by companies. And the green guides is out for public comment. I think public comment is due in the coming week, sometime in February. And the green guides is an opportunity for the federal government to take more of a stance on how to address the labeling currently on packages. So I think that's a great opportunity. And if folks are not aware of that public comment opportunity, we can drop it in the chat later. That's definitely an opportunity for national leadership. I'm sure there could be other opportunities as well. And I welcome Lawrence to chime in if he has any other thoughts.
Thank you.
And then next slide, I think we'll just introduce, I think it's the grants programs. Super excited that the bipartisan infrastructure law gave us a lot of funding, including to issue new recycling grants. So next slide, please. The two grants are basically broken down into the recycling education and outreach grants, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then Lawrence will break down the solid waste infrastructure for recycling grant programs. And there are actually three sub-programs under the infrastructure programs with different audiences and different applications. So he'll break that down. There's the political subdivisions category, the tribal and intertribal consortia, and the states and territories, which is actually a non-competitive application process. More about that in a minute. But I'll talk about recycling education and outreach. I'm also pleased that we have, each of our grant programs has a really nice website that summarizes the high-level details on each of the programs. We'll circulate a PDF of the slides after this call, so you can reference these websites later, but I'll go ahead and highlight some of the key points of the recycling education and outreach grant. So the eligible entities include states, Washington, D.C., territories, local governments, federally recognized tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and Office of Hawaiian Affairs, as well as nonprofit organizations. And what's unique about this is Congress gave us authority to provide funding and directed us to provide funding to public-private partnerships, which is a little unique with this grant program. And those are public-private partnerships that have to be codified in advance of applying for these opportunities. We anticipate issuing a total of $30 million for these grant programs. The award size is about $250,000 to $2 million, and applications are due February 15th. The legislation directed us that at least 20% of the funds must go to projects that serve low-income rural or Native American communities. EPA has opted to have a 40% set aside for these communities. And here are some of the projects that could be funded. These are just examples. They're not limited to this. Public service announcements, door-to-door campaigns, social media and digital outreach, advertising campaigns on recycling, labeling, business recycling outreach, toolkits for municipal or commercial recycling programs, as well as information on what happens after the recycling bin, the importance of quality in the recycling stream, the benefits of recycling, and community recycling ambassador education programs and trainer programs. Each grant project must meet at least one of these three criteria, either informing the public about the recycling programs and or providing information about what's recycled or composted in that area, and or increasing collection rates and decreasing contamination. And I'll now highlight another project that was funded under the bipartisan infrastructure law and released in November 2022. That is our model recycling program toolkit. It's an interactive repository of EPA and other materials that aim to assist communities in increasing participation in the recycling programs, reducing contamination in the recycling stream, setting up zero waste programs such as reuse centers, supporting backyard and neighborhood composting, setting up contracts with haulers, and more. And this is the link at which you can access the toolkit. When you do access the toolkit, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little feedback button, a little blue button. We welcome feedback. how this works, what could be better. This is a beta version. So please, if you do visit the toolkit, provide your constructive feedback on this toolkit. But the toolkit has 5 questions where you can respond and help filter the responses based on what you're interested in. For instance, under which tools and resources do you need? You can select if you're interested in best practices, case studies, definitions, educational materials for consumers, funding, market development, training resources, webinars, and more. After you select that, then you would advance, and then you would see what materials are available to you. One of the materials that we're excited about, and we also released in November, is a training module program. So these are online, on-demand training modules to help communities create messages that drive behavior change. We have learned that education alone rarely changes behavior, but there are things that we can do, social diffusion, using influencers, social norms, other things to help drive behavior change, not just educating people, but actually nudging them and helping understand how they work and what motivates them to change. So to better understand how to modify and develop your messages, we have these online training programs that include specific examples throughout the country of communities that have applied these to recycling, composting, and food waste prevention programs. This is the direct link to the behavior change training modules. There are webinars as well as a workbook. You can also find it by searching the toolkit. We're hoping to get this in front of more people. 3 communities, since releasing this in November, 3 communities have reached out to us, including Boston, indicating how useful these trainings were. So now I will turn it over to my colleague Lawrence, who will talk about Swiffer.
Thank you, Maya. That was great. So yes, my name is Lawrence. I'm an economist at EPA. Maya was talking about the Recycling Education and Outreach Grant Program. And so this component here, the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling Grant Program, is kind of the second leg of the 2 grant programs that were funded by Congress through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so there are 3 subprograms through the Swiffer grant program. I'll talk about all 3 of them. The first one I will talk about is for the states and territories. I recognize that we're talking to the Maryland Recycling Network. So we'll start with the state and territories. And here below, you can see there are links that go to each individual page. So this one's for the state and territory subprogram. So the Swiffer States and Territories program is available, as you can tell, to states and territories only. For this funding cycle, we're looking at about $30 million to be made available for states and territories. And what we're looking at is to help states and territories meet them where they are currently. So we're trying to help them with planning, implementation, development of post-consumer materials management plans. The money would go towards any sort of like capacity building, data collection, development of plans, solid waste management plans, all of that stuff. So this is a non-competitive funding opportunity. And so by non-competitive, we mean that states and territories are not competing against each other. Every state and every territory is eligible to receive funds. And so just in December of last year, which was last month, the EPA received notices of intent to participate from every single state and every single territory to be included in this program. So that includes Maryland. Maryland did submit a notice of intent to participate and will therefore receive funds for this program as long as they are proposing a project that would be an eligible activity. I'll talk about eligible activities in a minute. But just reiterating that every single state and every single territory did submit a notice of intent, which is fantastic. And so there are a couple deadlines that we have coming up for this program. The first one is the draft work plans. These are kind of a summary of various allocation and programmatic factors related to each state and territory solid waste management program. These are due on February 3rd. They were originally due tomorrow, but we did send a extension for a deadline extension. So that'll be due on February 3rd, which is next Friday. And then the other is the final grant applications, which will be covering everything for the proposal of each project that'll be due on May 31st. So that's kind of a ways away right now, but the big deadline coming up is February 3rd for the draft work plans.
Lawrence, quick question. Do you anticipate that there will be more funds available in 24, 25, et cetera, in this following years?
Yeah, so this is the first year of it. We have, like I said, $30 million for like the first year. We're not entirely sure what the funding mechanism will look like. We do have funding through 2026. We're not sure if it's going to look exactly the same as it is now, but we do intend to have more funding later on. We just can't really, we're not really sure exactly what the structure is going to look like at this time.
So you think the application process, notice of intent to apply, submit work plan, provide a grant application will be similar in structure and timeline to what we're doing this year?
I would suspect. I don't want to commit us to saying that it's going to be the same, but in terms of like this non-competitive program, since it is non-competitive, we are looking just for states and territories to tell us that they're interested in participating. I assume that'll be the same in future years, but again, we can't really know the exact funding structure in future years.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So looking at the eligible activities for this particular subprogram, this is somewhat unique in that it's focused on development, planning, and implementation of solid waste management activities. For this program, we're not looking at like hard infrastructure, construction, equipment. Those sorts of projects are not eligible under this non-competitive program for states and territories. The one exception, which you can see at the bottom of the screen here, is for territories. So for territories, equipment and construction and hard infrastructure are eligible, but for the states, they are not eligible. So therefore, for the states, the eligible projects are things like developing and updating plans to advance their post-consumer materials management programs, strengthening and implementing comprehensive data collection efforts, ideally ones that demonstrate any sort of progress towards EPA-led goals and strategies, and then state-led implementation of those solid waste management plans. I know that we're, again, talking to Maryland, but just as a kind of a heads up, for territories, we are offering that exception primarily because territories often lack the resources, both in terms of staff and budget, to apply for these sorts of grants competitively. And so again, since the objective of this particular sub-program is to help states and territories to meet them where they are currently, we wanted to provide that opportunity for territories to get the sorts of funds that they may not otherwise be able to get through a competitive process. So I will quickly talk about the kind of high-level components of these other two grant programs as well. This one being for the political subdivisions. So again, last one was for states and territories, a non-competitive program. This one is for political subdivisions, which is a competitive program. So a political subdivision is effectively a unit of local government. So you can see here some of the eligible entities are local governments, cities, counties, townships, villages, districts, but it also includes some of the state or territorial institutions of education, any sort of special districts. All of those are considered political subdivisions. If there's anything in like a local legislation that talks about being a political subdivision, it's very likely that you are an eligible entity for this program. So the estimated funding for the competitive SWIFR subprogram for political subdivisions is $40 million. Similar to the non-competitive, this is for the first round of funding, which would be for year one. And the applications for this program are due on February 15th, which is coming up in a few weeks. And I kind of just want to highlight that there are recordings and PowerPoints on these presentations for all three of the subprograms. So, you know, I'm kind of talking high level, but if you're interested in looking and listening in on more detailed explanations and descriptions of these programs, they are available on the EPA website. So eligible activities for this subprogram, this is what we would use to fund the infrastructure, hardware projects, equipment, construction things like the infrastructure or technologies for collection, the actual management of materials, improving the materials management infrastructure capacity, all of that stuff. So for the political subdivisions, this competitive program is more focused on infrastructure. We're also looking at funding end markets, materials and technology to measure diversion and recycling rates, quality of materials, and demonstrating some sort of significant increase in that recycling rate. And so the scope of work here, as you can see, is different than for the states and territories. Primarily, the sort of material management infrastructure is handled at a local level. It's cities that manage like their material recovery facilities. It's not really a state-led initiative. So for the political subdivisions, that's the focus, is helping with the infrastructure, any sort of like curbside collection program, that sort of stuff. And so finally, we'll talk about the Tribes and Intertribal Consortia subprogram. This is our most recently announced funding opportunity. We just had a couple webinars on the SWIFR for Tribes and Intertribal Consortia subprogram. If there are any colleagues here representing tribes, I hope you were able to listen on those, but if not, again, all of this stuff is available on our website. So the funding opportunity for Tribes and Intertribal Consortia is sort of a combined scope of the previous two subprograms that I was talking about. So obviously a different applicant pool. The eligible entities here are federally recognized tribes. Those include Alaskan Native villages, former Indian reservations in Oklahoma, and then intertribal consortia, so any sort of partnership among two or more tribes. Similar to the subdivisions, the estimated funding is around $40 million for the first year of funding, has a similar scope of eligible activities, and the applications are due on April 4th. And so you can see on this slide, again, this is kind of like a combination of the two. Tribes can really use these funds for development and updating of plans, capacity building, data collection. They can also use it for infrastructure. So establishing, increasing, expanding materials management infrastructure, end markets, increases in recycling rates. So you can, I'm not going to read everything off here, but you can see this is kind of a combination of both the non-competitive program for states and territories and then the competitive program for political subdivisions. I think we have a couple more webinars. We do a couple more webinars on the Tribes and Intertribal Consortia that are coming up, focused more on procurement subawards and questions. And so those are coming up. If you're interested in attending those, I'll leave this slide up for like 10 seconds. You can take a picture of this QR code and it'll take you straight there. Or you could also go onto the EPA website and type in like SWIFR, EPA, tribes, infrastructure, just use all your keywords, and the stuff will show up on the internet. So that kind of concludes the two big grant programs that were funded under the bipartisan infrastructure law. I will also talk about this last program. This is for battery collection best practices and labeling guidelines. Congress allocated the EPA $10 million to develop these best practices and an additional $15 million for battery labeling guidelines. And EPA has until September of 2026 to complete both of these tasks. So looking at batteries, just kind of going over like the importance of them. Obviously, they power many of the items in our daily lives, the electronics, like our phones and laptops, but also transportation methods like vehicles and bikes and buses. The batteries also contain critical minerals. These are the finite resources like lithium and cobalt and nickel that are needed to manufacture many of the common products that we use. And so the extraction of these critical minerals can negatively contribute to climate change. They're harmful to human health and they damage the environment, but these critical minerals also play a role in tackling climate change by powering wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, and more. So in 2020, the US used approximately 2.4 million tons of batteries, and the demand for batteries is estimated to triple by 2030 and increase sixfold by 2040 due to about a 23% yearly increase in demand for lithium-ion batteries. As you can see, mostly to power the rise of electric vehicles. So just a few benefits of batteries or recycling batteries. They prevent valuable materials from going into the waste stream and ultimately into the landfill. They reduce the energy needed and therefore the greenhouse gases generated to manufacture new batteries. And they reduce the extraction of valuable and limited virgin resources. So in the future, up to 40% of critical minerals in batteries may be supplied from recycled batteries. And then finally, the batteries often end up in the regular waste or the curbside recycling bins where they can potentially start fires. There's a lot of articles out there about MRF fires. They're often started by batteries. And the fires, of course, can cause things like air pollution and harm overburdened communities and threaten worker and first responder safety. So overall, what is the intent and the goal of this new battery collection best practices and labeling guidelines initiative? So we're looking to provide manufacturers, users, and handlers of batteries with information about how to safely collect batteries, along with how to label them. So we're looking at, the focus is really safe recycling of these batteries that we use every day. The initiative aims to develop best practices for battery collection that state, tribal, and local governments, including territories in DC, can implement when collecting batteries for recycling. So this includes identifying battery collection locations, increasing accessibility to those locations, and more. We're also looking at developing best practices that are technically and economically feasible, environmentally sound, and safe for waste management workers, and increasing the recovery of critical minerals from the recycling of batteries. And so we have obtained input from state, tribal, and local governments, as well as relevant non-governmental and private sector entities to inform the development of this best practices initiative. We've done feedback sessions. We had an RFI, a request for information, in the summer, and we are planning to develop a draft battery collection best practice report, which we will provide an opportunity on to provide public comment, at least probably this spring or this summer. So that's one component. We have like the best practices, and then we also have the labeling guidelines. So for the labeling guidelines, they're two separate initiatives, but they're obviously related. So for the labeling guideline, the goal is to establish a program that promotes battery recycling by developing voluntary labeling guidelines for the end of life of batteries and communication materials for battery producers, consumers, and other key stakeholders about the reuse and the recycling of critical minerals from batteries. So we're looking at, again, identifying collection locations, promoting consumer education about battery collection and recycling, reducing the improper disposal of batteries and associated fires, and just being consistent with international battery labeling standards that already exist. So similar to the best practices, we're looking at developing a draft report on battery labeling, and that will also be provided for public comment sometime, hopefully in the spring or in the summer. That was a lot of information, but we have some resources here. We've been kind of referring to some of those links at the bottom of each slide, but we do have a way to stay connected. So you can go to this website. This will kind of give you some updates on what's going on with the grant programs. Again, you can just type in like EPA Swiffer infrastructure program or bipartisan infrastructure law or recycling education in Google. And we have a bunch of pages up there right now about each of these programs, all of the information that we've talked about, including old webinars, presentations, recordings, etc. And then if you have any specific questions, because I know there are a lot of people here who are working for the state of Maryland or in some capacity with Maryland, you can reach out directly to our inboxes for these grant programs. So there's recycling, education, and outreach, the Swiffer program, and the batteries program. And so we'll try to get back to you if you have any kind of specific project questions. And that's all I've got.
Peter, I'm sorry, did you want us to put our questions in the chat or just, how do you want us to handle that?
Unmute my microphone. Yes, go ahead and ask. You're on the mic.
Okay. All right. So thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I do have a question for Maya on the education grant. Does that also include software that would measure rates of compliance so that our educational outreach programs are hitting the residents that we need to engage with more?
Thanks, Michelle. I believe it does. I will
Okay.
have to confirm for sure. In fact, so let me confirm. I believe it would. I believe it would be within the scope if that's part of the project plan. But I would need to confirm for sure.
Amy Marin posted a question in the chat about the battery program regarding whether or not it would have recommendations for how to structure municipal and county curbside collection or drop-off programs, I guess, to appropriately accommodate batteries.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be one component of the best practices guidelines. Again, that report will be put out for public comment. And so if there's stuff in there that you feel would be really useful for the community that's not included, that we would recommend providing public comment, and then we can add that to whatever kind of future draft would be included and updated.
Excellent. Thanks. Any other questions from our audience today? I know, as I mentioned before, a recording of this webinar will be posted on the website. That typically goes out to over 1,000 people, and we get a lot of feedback from that as well. Shannon, you got your hand raised. Want to go ahead and weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I just had a question and I typed it in the chat. So regarding the batteries, will there be any regulatory requirements that are going to be forthcoming from the guidelines? And I'm only asking this in a generality relating to plastics and the resin codes where, certain states, certain municipalities within each state, can recycle things, and it's confusing, which is why we have all this funding going forward with the Rio grant. But will there be any mandated requirements associated with those labels so that it does effectively help to reduce the amount of confusion associated with recycling moving forward, and mandating it as opposed to like offering a guideline?
So as of right now, I don't want to commit EPA to saying that we're going to provide any sort of regulatory action on this. The allocation from Congress was strictly to kind of like do the research and provide the reports on the best practices and the labeling guidelines. I think primarily because nationwide those don't exist for batteries. And so really just getting like the foundational work is the priority at this time. I totally hear where you're coming from, and it's similar to what Maya was saying with the green guides for like kind of an enforcement mechanism of like you can describe what the issue is, you can know what it is, but if there's nothing that's enforcing it, it's a different story. But yeah, at this time we're really focusing on like those two reports, getting them out, getting feedback, and having that foundational work set up to maybe do some of those other actions later on.
Maya, you see the question from Carol Jones about the...
I do see it. You can read it, and I don't... Go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like, and Carol, if I could paraphrase perhaps, do we assume that there will be a reduction in demand potentially driven by some of the changes that it may be made in the systems could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall? And that would be a supply chain thing from one to the other, right? Am I hitting this question the right way? Is that any clearer?
Is this a specific question about warm?
Yeah,
like the
it's
model?
yeah, the last question from Carol Jones. The last part of the question is, I don't know, but yes, it's about warm.
Or any other method, but you had identified warm as the model, which I'm familiar with, but I haven't used, so I don't understand the guts of it.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the warm model. We could connect you with someone there, but generally those sorts of things are really hard to model. So
Yeah.
If you were to look at like, the availability of recycled commodities, how that would change the supply and the demand in the market, like you can kind of look at how, less contamination would change the dynamics of supply and demand in the markets. But in terms of like reduction based on like source reduction policies, and like greenhouse gas emission reduction, like that's a little bit harder to model. Again, I'm not an expert in WARM, so we can connect you with someone there, but I would lean towards that's not being modeled and estimated there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem if we can't really fully capture, which I understand. I'm an economist. It's very difficult to do, but if we can't fully capture the greenhouse gas impacts, then we're really underestimating the benefits, you know, associated with source reduction and reuse and you know, recycling as well. But I mean, source reduction is really powerful. I'm thinking about food waste. You know, source reduction is very, very powerful relative to recycling.
Certainly.
I think there are some numbers for food waste, but you know, for other waste streams, I'm wondering about that. So
yeah, again, if you want us to put you in touch with someone who works on WARM, we can do that.
And
that'd be great.
I suspect the upstream folks may also have some numbers they've generated around that, because they're looking at source reduction and reuse as two strategies to reduce greenhouse gases.
I'm sorry, which people are you talking about, Peter?
Upstream, UPSTREAM. They're doing a presentation for us in April with Crystal Dreisbach from Don't Waste Durham.
I thought you were talking about generic, you know, upstream sectors. Thank you for clarifying.
No problem at all. No problem. There's a lot more conversation, and I applaud the EPA for emphasizing there are a couple other R's out there besides the recycling one, and the impact on the supply chain and literally on virgin materials of reuse and reduction could be quite substantial. And last but not least, I want to remind everybody again of our upcoming programs. And of course, if you're not a member of the Maryland Recycling Network, we invite you, of course, to join us and help support our efforts to not only deliver programs like this, but all the work we do in Annapolis every year, trying to make sure the legislators are making life better rather than more difficult for the recycling community generally. So with that, I want to have a big round of applause for Maya and Lawrence. Thank you guys for an excellent presentation today. As I noted, we'll have this webinar posted on the website in a day or so, and welcome any questions anybody would like to send to us after the fact. Be happy to take care of them in any possible way we can. And thanks again, Lawrence and Maya, for being with us today. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.